I have the privilege here to go ahead and introduce Ben Marks. Ben has had the challenge of scaling Salesforce's Mac deployment by nearly 75%, and he's here to tell us what he's learned along the way. So without further ado, Ben.
All right, in the name of full disclosure, I had a rough flight, so I'm a little slow this morning, so please bear with me. I didn't plan to wear the Steve shirt, but my other shirt didn't make it on the airplane. I'll just leave it at that and spare you the rest of the grossness of it. But yes, my name is Ben Marks. I work for Salesforce. I'm a client engineer. What that basically means is I get to do all this fun stuff, but I don't have to deal with users anymore. We've sort of reached that final plateau where you just get to help other teams and don't have to deal with some of the day-to-day stuff and get to design stuff instead of having to deal with some of the rudimentary troubleshooting. Before Salesforce, I worked for this crazy little place in Big Sur called the Esalen Institute. That picture up there, or let me just go forward. That was our internet connection. If you look 12 miles down the coast in Big Sur, that's where we were, 4 T1s. And before that, I was a Mac genius starting in Tysons Corner, Virginia. So I'm proof that you can actually hire these kinds of jobs from Apple Retail. I like to defend us Mac geniuses. But the reason I bring up Esalen is because even before Salesforce, I was dealing with setting up Casper, supporting Casper. There, it was a 120 Mac network, a single JSS on a little Mac, actually it was an Xserve at that time. And then from there, I got hired at Salesforce, and then that's now why I'm here. So some of the things I'm going to talk about are mainly my experience, since Salesforce. I'm going to start with the merits of having to set this all up from scratch. This isn't going to be a rehash of the JDS. We're not going to go into a ton of technical details, but I recommend checking the JDS if you have to support this kind of stuff. But even if you can just set it up from scratch, you will be the next Don Montalvo if you can do that, because most of the questions that a lot of the setup questions and upgrade questions that people have on Jamf Nation are actually, can really easily be solved if you could do something from a manual standpoint. So if you get good at that, that's gonna really help you in the long run. Scaling too, as you build this out and it gets bigger and bigger. I'm going to talk about planning and how before you even have your JSS, some of the things that you can focus on. With the idea of making your database portable. And what I mean by that is, if you don't make some of the common mistakes right from the beginning, that's going to make it far easier for you if you ever decide to move your database to a new set of hardware, to a virtualized environment, or even if you want to move to the cloud. Making some important decisions right up front is going to make your life a million times easier. We didn't do that, so that's why that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about. I'm also going to be discussing resource allocation. There's some documentation out there. A lot of this is just trial and error. I like to say, every JSS is its unique snowflake. What I talk about may not be remotely relevant to somebody else, of similar size even. They may have different policies, different extension attributes, different check-in settings. My database is 10 gigabytes, their database be 100 gigabytes, But, coming up with good resource allocation right from the beginning, is really going to make your life a lot easier. And I'm going to get into some specifics. For example, load balancer, that's a really big one when it comes to scaling. While it can be relatively simple, it can also be relatively easy to make some mistakes. I'm going to discuss some pretty hardcore issues that we've had over the last month that ended up being related to our load balancer. Similarly, I'm going to talk about some, clustering, some bottlenecks and troubleshooting, and stuff like that as well. But as I was just talking about, one thing I really stress is whether it's in your, if you have it, a test environment, or if you don't have a test environment, in your production environment. One thing that's really great to be able to do is to set this up from scratch. Don't rely on Jamf's installer. I'm not saying you can't use Jamf's installer. I mean, Jamf's installer is great, but if you rely on the installer, you can fall into a lot of, how do I say this? The issues that you'll experience with it are very easily resolved if you're familiar with the manual installation. But if you're just relying on the installer, you can get caught up by some pretty simple stuff. So, for example, on Jamf Nation, there's the 3 installers for the 3 platforms, and then there's the 4th one that's manual download or download installation. Inside of that, all you really get is the single file that is your JSS, which is that root.war file. Everything else, installing Apache, Tomcat, installing MySQL, whether it's on that same virtual machine, installing Java, try and at least go through one, try to do this on your own at least once, and trying to go through one upgrade process on your own as well. Because if you can get familiar with that, you're going to be able to, you're probably not going to have any issues from that point going forward when it comes to upgrading your JSS to new versions in the future. So right now, I think Tomcat is up to version 8. I think it's 8.37, 0.37. I have no idea what the version of Java is now. 1.8 something. MySQL 5.6. I would recommend 5.6 for now. If you're not an expert with MySQL, 5.7 I've had a lot of issues with as far as it asking for passwords in really random places. Maybe that's been resolved, but 5.6 seems to be what most people are using anyways. And another reason I recommend this is because, a lot of us are familiar with the terminal, are familiar with the command line, but a lot of us don't want anything to do with any of those things. Or a lot of us are training people who don't want anything to do with any of those things. And this is a great educational opportunity, that you can take on for yourself, or that you can hand off to a lower level technician. Focus on a singular task, and try and install all those things manually. Install the root.war, see what issues you encounter, and then just try and install an upgrade when an upgrade comes out. This, I think, is it's just a really great gateway into learning the command line, because while, things like server app, things like the JSS, they try to take you as much away from that as possible, at least with the turning things on, turning things off, things like, the basic services. When you really want to get into the deep details, server app, for example, not a lot of features have actually been removed from server app over the last few years. It's just a lot of them are now lowered in the app. There are much more things that you can only do at the command line now. And so using these things as a gateway, I think really prepares you, for the future, not just for troubleshooting Macs, but also your JSS may move to Linux. It may move to another platform, and that whole process will be much easier for you. That's what we did. My first JSS was, like I said, a single Xserve running macOS 10. I think it was Lion actually. But my predecessor there had bought 6 last generation Xserves the last day they could purchase them, and then left the company. So my first day there, was to come into a giant stack of Xserves and to figure out what to do with them. And one of them was, I didn't need an Xserve for the JSS, but I had 6 of them. Why not? And then from there, at Salesforce, I then inherited a JSS that at the time was a single Windows Server 2008 virtual machine. And in both of these cases, the database was shared on the at S1's case, on the bare metal, at Salesforce's case, on the virtual machine. So that's another thing we're going to talk about is separating those and how that can help your life as well. But sorry. But again, if you can do a manual install and do one upgrade, that's going to prepare you, for anything that's going to hit you coming forward. If you go in taking the JDS class, if you decide to do that, you're going to be way ahead of anybody else that's in that class. So it's not exactly, something I've learned, from a technical standpoint, but it's something that I highly recommend. Whether you're that technician learning it on your own, or whether you're that technician, training a lower level technician. So here are some of the things that I was talking about where you really want to get these right from the beginning. And some of these are just limitations of the JSS and not problems, but just how it works. So number one, pick your URL right off the bat. Pick it as if it's never ever going to change. We didn't do that. The one I inherited was a what was it? It's a dot. I can't remember what it was. Dot inside. It was just dot inside, and so that made things much more difficult. But you want to pick your URL right up front. Pick something public. If you own a domain, great. If you don't own a domain, get one. It's $8, $6, $5, whatever they are now. If you don't have an SSL certificate, get one. I don't know. I was just looking at some $50. You don't need static IP. That's more for your local setup. But the first 3 are the most important because the database, especially if you're using SSL, especially if you're using File Vault, especially if you're using mobile devices, really doesn't like the URL to be changed. Really doesn't like the SSL certificate to be changed. So if you pick these things right up front, then that's going to make your database that much more portable, whether you're moving it to a new server infrastructure, whether that's bare metal, whether that's virtualized, or whether you decide to move that database to the cloud. For us, when I was redesigning our JSS, I had to pick a URL. We had the individual challenge of having a subdomain. So it was .corp.salesforce.com. In this case, jss.corp.salesforce.com. That was what I settled on when we were redesigning it. But that's a publicly routable domain, so that if we do decide to move our database to the cloud, we don't really have to change anything. We don't have to even re-enroll any clients or anything. We can just take our database file, upload it to the cloud, do some DNS trickery so that everything resolves to the cloud. But otherwise, that's it. That's the list. So if you do these things right off the bat, you're going to have a very, very, very portable database. And that's going to be a theme that you'll see me talk about here a couple times. Because you're also going to want to move your database, even if you're a small JSS, for performance reasons, get it off of that single, monolithic bare metal, monolithic hardware, and put it on its own separate machine. That's probably step 1 of scaling of the JSS. So getting all this stuff right from the start is going to really set you up for success. Now, the next thing that normally comes up is what kinds of resources do you want to allocate to your JSS? Now, That can be, when you're starting out, as simple as what kind of machine do you want to run it on. You know, for most places, a single Mac Mini might be fine. For us at Esalen, a Mac Serve was supreme overkill for the I think it's still there now. You know, when you move it into a virtualized environment, it's going to be about, you know, CPUs and RAM and storage speed and things like that. So the first thing that I would recommend is ask your TAM. There is a resources document that does exist. Now, we had to ask about 3 times before it was actually acknowledged. It's not a criticism of Jamf, it just, for whatever reasons, our first TAM didn't know about this document. But that's a really great starting point. I'll provide, I'm not going to provide a link to that. I'm going to recommend getting it from your TAM. I'm going to go back to what I said a little while ago, which is, you know, that every JSS is unique. And really be careful when you're using this document, because it's not as simple as, oh, I have 5,000 users, you know, let me allocate 12 virtual VMware CPUs to it. You know, it's not as simple as that. But this document is a great starting point for your planning. You know, for me, it was a great tool to have because I don't create the virtual machines. I don't own our ESX environment, so I had to rely on other teams to do that work for me. And, you know, a situation like that, they're going to ask you, you know, why do you need 12 CPUs for this? You know, why do you need 16 gigabytes of RAM for this? And by having a document that I could take and show them, you know, I was able to get all of that all of those resources allocated, you know, without really any questions asked. You know, the next decision is bare metal or virtualized. You know, I mean, I'm sure there are still some purists who want to do this 100% on Macs. If I was in a smaller organization, I would probably still try to do that as well. It's a bit challenging to scale, where, you know, with our size, with Mac Minis, you know, adding massive amounts of Mac Minis to an ESX cluster. And actually, that reminds me, I should take a step back. One of the reasons why I think Jamf thought that it was a good example of how to talk about this today is because of the explosive growth that we've had over the last three and a half years. When I started at Salesforce about 3.5 years ago, the Mac was about, I think it was a little bit under 40% of our environment. And that added up to about a little bit under 4,000. I think it was 3,500 Macs. In the 3.5 years since then, the Mac is just under 70% of our environment, and that adds up to about 23,000 Macintoshes. So, you know, we've seen explosive growth, and, you know, we had to build our JSS, you know, to not only accommodate for that, but we also had to plan for future explosive growth. You know, how are we going to make this easier on ourselves going forward? And also, you know, how are we going to potentially plan for future where we may add in our mobile devices as well? Right now, we don't use Casper for our iOS devices. We use a separate product, but it's always, you know, periodically on the table that we may consolidate everything into Jamf. So, you know, we had to plan for that as well. So that's, I think that's one of the reasons why they thought it might be a good idea that I speak here, independent of my lack of experience talking in front of environments. So please forgive me. But again, bare metal virtual machine. Before me, we started out, I think they went through the same cycles as Esalen. I think they started out with an Xserve, got one of the last ones. That didn't work for various reasons. Went to the single monolithic Windows virtual machine. That didn't work for various reasons. And so then when I started, that's where I came along. And so our current JSS and again, don't write these down because this is unique to us, but our current JSS is 5 Linux virtual machines. 4 of them are behind a load balancer. One of them is solely internal. That's our management console. But the other 4 are in the DMZ, behind that publicly routable domain name, behind a load balancer. That's not going to work for everybody either. Everybody's JSS is going to be different. In my opinion, being in a virtualized solution is going to make getting to a larger size easier on you. But again, like I was saying, there's still some purists, I'm sure, who want to run all this on Mac hardware. It's awkward, but there's that Sonnet rack mountable, case for dual Mac Pros or single Mac Pros too. There's a K-based article, it's fully supported. But that may not be the least path of resistance when it's coming to scaling this stuff. So that's a decision you'd have to make. Single or multiple JSSs, like I was just talking about, once you get to a certain size, you're going to want to divide this up. Load balancer, once you get to a certain size, you're going to want to divide this up. And separating Tomcat from MySQL, that's something you're really going to want to focus on as well. I didn't mention our database isn't on any of those 5 VMs. It's on its own single, on its own special database VM that's supported by another team, to which I have very little access. So that may be your environment where one team builds this, one team builds this, one team builds this. That can, as your organization gets bigger, but planning all the stuff in advance is with those things in mind is going to be, real important, right? Just right off the bat. Let me look at something here real fast. All right. Now, one of the things that I was just mentioning earlier was the load balancer. I will link on our website later some screenshots of my load balancer. We use F5. That seems to be the most common one. I've taken all the other JAMP classes, and most of the people in those other classes seem to F5 seems to be a pretty big one out there. So, why I'm not going to, with the stuff that I post at the end, I'm not going to focus too much on vendor-specific stuff. I will post, some of the most common settings, that you want to set on your load balancer, because while it is easy to set up, there are a couple settings that if you mess up can make your life rather miserable. For example, for most of the last month, I've been waking up along with one of my coworkers at 1 in the morning every night for a few weeks with multiple VMs of ours just dropping off out of our clustering. They just disappeared. And we couldn't figure out why. And before this month, we only had 2 VMs in the load balancer. Those were Red Hat. For troubleshooting purposes, we created 2 more. Those were CentOS, because we're migrating to CentOS. But those immediately also had the same issue. So two brand new VMs of a different OS, 2 old VMs of a previous OS exhibited the exact same issue right from day one. But only the ones in our DMZ, only the ones behind the load balancer exhibited these issues. The internal VM that we set up for management never exhibited any of these issues. So we went through database settings, we went through all the server.xml settings for Tomcat. We upgraded everything to the current versions, because some of our stuff was behind. We made sure everything was exactly the same. we were doing all this in conjunction with Jamf. Couldn't figure it out. And then, out of the blue, our team that manages mobile devices started to have issues as well. Now, they had completely different issues, but they were having issues as well. And the only unique feature between the two environments was our load balancer. And it turned out that there was a setting, and I'll post the details of this in the notes that I put up after this presentation, because I don't fully understand it myself, to be perfectly honest. But it was something related to the something called the SNAT pool. But basically, what was happening was, as connections came into our load balancer, they were being assigned IP addresses, and eventually they would all get used up. And so at about 10 o'clock in the evening, we'd see the failures about 1 in the morning, but once we started tracking logs, they actually happened at about 10 in the evening. Like clockwork, every single night, those pools of IP addresses that the load balancer used were being exhausted, and then the load balancer would start sending junk data to a random couple of our Tomcat VMs, and you'd see in the logs what looked like SSL text, and then they would just die. They would just drop off. Now, when we only had 2 of them, that would lead to outages, and because for us, we're 24/7. We have people re-imaging machines, around the clock. So Casper is pretty critical service for us. So when something would go down at 1 in the morning our time, that's all the Australian and Asian provisioners coming online and immediately screaming and shouting about how they can't do their jobs. So that was one of the reasons we added the 2 additional VMs. But again, exact same issues. So I just give that as an example of something that's relatively easy to set up, but at the same time, it can wreak havoc if you don't really know what you're doing. For us, it wasn't that we didn't have people that knew what they were doing. It was for whatever reason that team had a lot of turmoil, and so our project kept getting handed off to one person after another person after another person, and it just never really got set up the way that it was needed to be set up. But it was our mobile team that finally yelled loud enough that they got the F5 people on the phone, and the F5 people within about 5 minutes were like, "Oh, this is your issue," and then it was miraculously fixed for us and for our mobile team. So just an example of some things that you want to avoid. Now Jamf, they're not going to advertise that they have resources specific to vendors either, but I think there is we were able to get on a call with some Jamf team members that did have a lot of experience with F5 as well. So that's another example of you may have to ask a couple times, just like with the resources document, but press a little bit, because you may eventually be able to get to the resources that you need. They are there, and Jamf certainly was incredibly helpful and timely in doing so. But sometimes you have to ask a couple times. Hold on just 1 second. Oh, shoot. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Now, also one of the big decisions that you're really going to want to make, when you're designing this, from the beginning, is separating Tomcat and your database. For us, like I said, there were some pluses and minuses for us doing it. We had to give up a lot of control when we gave our database team ownership of our database. And that may be the case for a lot of you, depending on how your organization is set up. So there's some pluses and minuses to this, but from a scalability and portability standpoint, this is going to be one of the biggest things that you're going to do, because it's going to separate, it's going to allocate all of your resources on your Tomcat VMs just to Tomcat, and it's going to allocate your resources to your database just to the database. And it's going to increase your performance, but it's also going to make troubleshooting easier. If you're experiencing issues, you don't have to focus on one, where it could be, they call it conflicting with each other, any number of different, number of reasons. You can focus on one or the other. It's going to make your life a bit easier from that standpoint. Now, the database itself. So one of the things that we've had a lot of problems over the years with various tables becoming corrupted, and I think we've resolved them. A lot of it was self-inflicted, based on some of the things that I've mentioned. But one of the things that you're going to want to focus on, and this is where I say again, every JSS is its unique snowflake. Our JSS with 23,000 max may require much fewer resources than a JSS that maybe only 1,000 max or 500 max. Because for right now, for us, what we use Casper for primarily is imaging. I know, there are probably plenty of you out there are saying thin imaging or DEP or any of these new technologies. But for us, security is a big deal for us. And one of the things that we do, like we haven't, for example, qualified Sierra for use yet. This year and last year as well, we were lucky enough that we could continue installing the older operating system on new hardware, after the release. That's not always the case, as I'm sure you know. Sometimes, if there are new machines coming out in October or in January, whenever, those will almost certainly be firmware locked to Sierra. But for us, this is a bit of a tangent. I'm just defending why we image, but security for us is a big deal, and so we're still running Sierra through all of its various paces with our security teams. So it should be soon for us, but it's that's one of the huge features that we use Casper for. So imaging is a big deal for us, but because of that, it's only recently that we've been migrating away from some of our other products to do some of the newer stuff. Like, I'm sure this audience is much smaller because everybody went to the patch management presentation. I would be there too if I wasn't speaking. But patch management is a really big feature coming down the road for us as well. Just by nature of initiating a feature like that, that's going to make our database bigger. But right now we have a pretty small database. But another corporation or institution or university, they may do way more with a much smaller JSS. So you want to keep an eye on your database size. And there's no universality to this either. But the bigger your database is, just by nature of the product, the lower your performance may become. So for us, we kept real close track on, what settings made a big difference as far as database size. And part of that was also because what I was just mentioning, where, we had some tables that just would like to become corrupt more than others. The biggest ones were the applications table and the applications usage table. Those, for whatever reason, were just, for us, whatever reason, were just notoriously unstable. And so sometimes after upgrades, we'd get to the progress bar and the upgrade, and it'd just sit there analyzing applications table, and it would just sit there. And 16 hours later, it would just, sit there analyzing the applications table, and your Friday night has now become Sunday, and you're running out of time, with the window that you've allocated for getting this back up, and you're starting to, freak out. So what we did in that case, we actually turn the setting for collecting application usage off. Now in the future, this setting may actually do something. I personally don't find it useful at all. You may have a workflow that relies on those little graphs that it shows you for your individual machines, but what else can you do with that? For right now, that's all that you can really do with it. Those, without creating extension attributes or without, creating some other infrastructure behind that, it's really, in my opinion, just sort of a bell and whistle for now, where it shows you over the last week this user has used Word, 6 hours. Again, some of you may rely on that. By collecting that, that will become your biggest table, and that will exponentially increase your database size. So that's just something to consider when you're turning on some of these things. Some other big ones that really affect it are check-in time and recon time. And there's another great article that I'll link. I didn't link to it. I'll link to it at the end in my notes. I think it was very recently published, but it's a great article that really spells out what the differences are between what a recon does and what a check-in does. And for us, because we're focused on security, we're really focusing more on these patch management capabilities. We wanted to have I'm going to get this reversed. We wanted our check-in times to be as frequent as possible so that those machines would become relevant for the patches. I need to review this document myself, apparently. I believe my point is the two different communications between your JSS and your machines will trigger different stuff. So you just want to be aware of that. Because for us it was important to have our machines at least check in daily so that they would pick up patches as soon as they became relevant. For other people, you may rely on your users to do that. That may not be as big of a deal, but for us, we focus on it more from the standpoint of pushing things out, making sure that everybody has the new Flash as soon as possible, and we don't rely on our users to do that kind of stuff. So, but again, that's us. But all these things will have a huge effect on your database size. And the last one I'll mention is extension attributes. We use a ton of extension attributes, but you want to be careful with extension attributes because they can really bog down your JSS as well. And I'm going way over what I thought I had. So let me just run through this here real fast. One other thing, so we lost control over our database. Some things you can use, if that happens to you can use there's some third-party apps that you can really use to get some of this control back. MySQL Workbench is great because you're still going to have your username and password associated with your database. And that way you can sit on the phone if Jamf has commands for you to run. You can still do those through an app. Sometimes you're just going to need to manually purge a table. We've had to create workflows, for us to manually purge that applications table from time to time. Hopefully you don't have to do that, but that's something we've had to do. The last one I'll mention, I'm not an expert, but in this the database engine, rendering engine, but once you're past a certain size, you're going to want to think about moving to InnoDB. The default is my ISAM. I don't know if they're really, tried and true numbers for when to do this, but there are some advantages to InnoDB. Some of our issues went away when we moved to InnoDB. It locks tables differently, and we found some of our table corruption has gone away. But that's something you'll want to, if you have a database team, work with them. It's a little harder to set up, and you have to do it table by table. But that's something you'll want to focus on or think about as well. Let's see, I'll just run through these last few. Didn't time myself very well. But yeah, some performance bottlenecks. If your Tomcat VMs are in one data center and your database is in a different data center, that might not be the best idea, because then you're going to be relying on what may not be the best network bandwidth between the two. So when you're designing this, make sure all your VMs are in the same place. If different teams are setting this stuff up for you, it may not even think to them, to make sure of this, because the database team may have their own data center, and the VMware team that mainly sets up VMs for developers may have their own data center. it didn't cross their minds that, these things would be close together. There's some server XML, database XML settings. A lot of this stuff is not really well documented on Jamf Nation and near my assets tab. So just, it's easy to set up, but it's easy to mess up. So, just focus on those as well. Take the JDS class. I learned a ton from it. It's probably one of the reasons why I'm here, but I didn't need to take it to be standing here, but it really, really helped. And again, database size, keep an eye on what you're doing and how it affects database size, because the larger your database is, the poorer the performance is going to be. And this is my last one. So yeah, troubleshooting, losing location of Java, that's probably one of the biggest ones when you're upgrading. Once you've done it manually, it's going to make your life a million times easier. Get good at reading the log files. MySQL Workbench as a monitoring tool is going to be great. And I'll have some other notes about the specifics I set up here. Yes, it's a Mac. Yes, it's running Wiki service, but I owned it all, so it was free to set up. But sorry that was rushed at the end, but my timing is terrible. So, but yeah, I guess I'll open it up for questions now.
Right, well, if we can get a big round of applause for Ben right here, taking the time out here for Salesforce. Thank you very much. I've got a few questions here that came in over Twitter. I'll go ahead and start with the first one here. So you mentioned early on the benefit of making some mistakes, and I was kind of curious, what kind of quote-unquote mistakes or challenges did you guys encounter at Salesforce when you decided to start scaling out your Jamf deployment?
I think the big one was the URL. That was the biggest one, is not having a publicly routable URL.
Go ahead and pop in the mic. I think
Sorry.
Folks probably can't hear you.
The biggest one is probably not having a DNS routable domain name for our database. We had something that was solely internal, so that we wanted, because our original JSS was not in the DMZ, so that when we wanted to put this stuff in the DMZ, we had to start from scratch. And 9 months later, we're actually still trying to work through some issues with our security team, who doesn't want us to show pop-ups to our users, so that we can remediate a lot of the file vault key issues. When you move when you move like that and you have to change your URL, one of the things that is really challenging is getting the file vault keys back. There's a whole script that you can get from your TAM. There's some but it only runs under certain triggers. But without doing that, that made it much harder for us to migrate. And like I said, we're still trying to remediate some of the file vault key issues that we're having. If we had mobile devices, that would have made it even worse. We didn't, but if we had mobile devices, they would have all had to re-enroll as well. So that was probably one of the biggest ones that we made.
Right on, thank you. Next up, the question I have here is, how has Salesforce set up communication for remote users outside of your network? Anything learned when scaling that, security-wise, any challenges there?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have an answer to it.
I don't know is an acceptable answer.
I think, a challenge for us, we have some really strict security requirements. And, to be honest, we're still trying to make sure that everything that we display to our users looks a very specific way. So, we only use some of one of the 3 different ways that you can show pop-ups, because it's the one that looks the most authentic. Yeah,
That's okay.
I don't have a better answer for that.
We'll change gears here to our last question, just more of a broad question here, but what were some of the noticeable reasons you've seen such a large growth in Mac usage at Salesforce, going from nearly 25% to now, it looks like 75%?
I think one of the big numbers is a number that IBM published last year. And I don't remember what the number is, but I remember it was something like, for every hour, I'm going to get this number wrong, I'm going to butcher it, but look it up. But for every hour that their tech support agents have to deal with the Windows machine, it's something like 7 minutes that they have to spend, on a Mac platform. So, so that was a big driver. Just we don't experience a ton of issues with our Macs. They're incredibly reliable. We just experience the same issues over and over. Just like a lot of people experience, Mac integration with Active Directory, things like that. But overall, we've just found them to be much more reliable. There's just far less support that goes into it. And then, to be honest, a lot of the tools, in many ways, Apple and Jamf are ahead of the curve when it comes to managing, these devices. DEP makes our lives a million times easier. Configuration profiles, in my opinion, make our lives a million times easier. When you really get in, to using those services, you can get even away from imaging and just, even if you're as strict as we are with security, you can still dovetail that with just handing out machines to users and not even getting away from imaging and stuff. So that's another big one.
Excellent. We had 2 more pop in here I'd like to actually give some time to. Adam Kodega has asked, monitoring recommendations. Are there any differences from what your larger team uses from maybe what you use?
Sorry, repeat the question?
And I apologize if I got this wrong. It says monitoring recommendations. Are they different rather from what your larger team uses?
From our what team?
Larger.
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. We don't monitor a lot of Macs on our own. That we're sort of abstracted from that. We're now that we've expanded our use of Casper, we're only now beginning to empower our support agents to use it to do a lot of those types of things. But up until now, we're separated from that part of it. Now, I think that's the answer to the question. Unless they meant monitoring our JSS.
Could be different, and if you want after the session, maybe you meet up with them. One last one here. Sarasota 6 has asked, what did you change in the F5 load balancer settings in regards to the snap pool issue?
So again, I'm not the expert in this area, but I believe ours was set to, if I understand it correctly, that setting in ours was set to infinite. And what that meant was it never released the IP addresses that it was handing out, so that it eventually just used them all up and never gave them back. And so in working with Jamf and in working with F5 support, we changed that to, I don't know what we changed it to. I'd have to look at my notes. Something very small, so that those IP addresses were then constantly put back into the pool. Because like I said, when it was set to what it was, infinite, just like clockwork at 10-ish every night, it just starts sending junk data to our VMs. And luckily, once we had 4, we didn't have to stay up until 1 in the morning and only knock out 2 of them. So our first task in the morning would be to power up or bring back up the other 2. But yeah, I believe that was the setting that they changed. It was just from infinite back to, I think it was 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Ben one more time. If we can get one more round of applause for Ben's time. Thank you very much.